The galaxy was a place of endless conflict. Stars burned brightly in the vast emptiness, while fleets of ships from different worlds clashed in the darkness. Two powerful factions had fought for centuries over control of territory and resources. The Xerac, a race of tall, armored beings with silver skin and sharp minds, were one of the most dominant species in the galaxy. They ruled with an iron fist, their queen, Xerantha, revered as a nearly divine figure. But now, her throne was under threat. Xerantha, the mighty queen, had been struck down in a surprise attack by an unknown enemy. The ambush came without warning in the dead of night, as her royal ship made its way to a neutral space station for peace talks. The Xerac fleet had been caught off guard, and their enemies, ruthless and well-prepared, launched a devastating assault. Within moments, their flagship was in ruins, and Xerantha, the symbol of Xerac strength, was severely injured. In the wake of the attack, chaos spread throughout the Xerac Empire. The queen was paralyzed, her once mighty body now unable to move. Her eyes remained open, her mind sharp, but she was trapped in a prison of her own flesh. A handful of Xerac soldiers had managed to bring her aboard a neutral space station, hoping to find a way to save her. But the situation was grim. The Xerac's medical technology was advanced, far beyond what most other species could achieve. Their medics were skilled in the art of healing, able to mend bones and flesh in a matter of hours, but nothing in their arsenal could fix what had happened to Xerantha. She had suffered extensive damage to her spine, and her body was slowly shutting down. No one could help her. At least, that's what the Council of the Xerac believed. The Council was made up of the Empire's most influential leaders. Cold and calculating, they valued strength above all else. When they arrived at the station to see their queen's condition, they wasted no time in making a decision. It was too dangerous to risk their future for a single individual. To them, Xerantha was no longer of use. Her injury had made her weak, and weakness was not something that could be tolerated in their world. "We must leave her to die," one of the council members said, his voice emotionless as he stared down at Xerantha's still form. Another agreed. "The Xerac will find a new leader. It is the way of our people." The room fell silent. The queen, lying unconscious on the operating table, was oblivious to the conversation taking place. The fate of the Empire had been decided by the Council. There was no room for mercy in their decision. However, there was one individual who disagreed. Dr. Evan Blake, a human medic stationed aboard the neutral space station, had heard of the Queen's condition. He was not a member of any faction. He had no loyalty to the Xerac, but he was a man of compassion. The moment he learned of Xerantha's injuries, he couldn't turn away. The idea of abandoning her, even if she were an alien, filled him with a deep sense of sorrow. He had seen countless lives lost to war, but this was different. This was a life that could still be saved. Blake was not like the Xerac. He wasn't hardened by years of conflict. He wasn't a soldier or a diplomat. He was a medic, and his job was to save lives, no matter the cost. He wasn't afraid of the risks. "What are you saying, human?" One of the Xerac officials barked when Blake approached. "You think you can save her? You are a medic, not a miracle worker." Blake stood tall, unwavering. "I can help her. I've seen injuries like this before. We have technology that might give her a chance." The council laughed, a harsh, cold sound that echoed through the sterile room. "You are a fool," one of them said. "The Xerac are beyond saving. This is the way of the galaxy." But Blake didn't care about their words. He had seen too many lives slip away without anyone trying to help. This was his chance to do something, to make a difference. He turned to the queen, who lay motionless on the table, her silver skin pale in the harsh light. "I'm not giving up," Blake whispered to himself, though no one else heard. "I'm not letting you die." He knew the risks. He knew that Xerac would never forgive him if he failed. But he was determined to try. This was his moment to prove that humanity had something the galaxy needed: the will to fight for life. no matter the odds. And with that, Blake began to prepare for the most difficult challenge of his career. The Queen's survival would depend on his skill, his ingenuity, and his refusal to accept the idea of giving up. In the quiet hum of the station's medical bay, the fate of two worlds hung in the balance. Blake's heart raced as he prepared to begin his work. The room was sterile, the hum of medical equipment filling the silence. Zarantha, the Queen of the Terek, lay motionless on the table, her once proud figure now a shadow of what she had been. Her body was still, but her eyes remained open, gazing into the unknown. She had been a symbol of power for her people, and now she was a fragile life waiting for a miracle. The Exarech Council had already made up their minds. They believed there was no hope for her, but Blake wasn't ready to give up. He knew that saving Zarantha would not only be a medical challenge, but also a test of his own courage. There were risks involved, huge risks. If he failed, the consequences could be dire. The Exarech were not known for their mercy, but Blake wasn't concerned about that. What mattered to him was the chance to save a life. He looked around the sterile medical bay. Advanced equipment, state-of-the-art medical tools, and complex instruments lined the walls. Yet none of these had been able to help Zarantha so far. The problem was not a lack of technology, but the Exarech's alien physiology. Their bodies were vastly different from human beings. What worked for humans didn't work for them. Blake had to find a way to treat her without the usual methods he had relied on. He paced back and forth, running his fingers through his hair in frustration. He had studied alien anatomy in his training, but nothing had prepared him for this. The Exarech were stronger, their bones denser, and their nervous systems vastly more complex than anything he had encountered. Yet Blake knew one thing for sure: no one else was going to try. If there was a chance, even the smallest chance, it was up to him. His thoughts were interrupted by the cold voice of a Exarech officer standing near the door. "Are you still wasting time, human?" The officer sneered. "There is no point. Her condition is beyond your abilities. Leave it to those who know what they're doing." Blake didn't respond. He didn't have time for their doubts. His focus was entirely on the Queen. The officer's words stung, but they only made him more determined. He knew that if Zarantha was to have any chance at survival, he had to push the limits of what was possible. He couldn't afford to fail. The first step was understanding her injury. Blake had studied her medical files, but there was nothing in them that could prepare him for the reality of her condition. Her spine was damaged, leaving her unable to move. Her organs were in critical condition due to the shock. The paralysis was so severe that it seemed impossible for her to ever walk again. But Blake wasn't giving up. He had seen patients in worse conditions make a miraculous recovery, and he believed that Zarantha, with the right treatment, could pull through. He began by carefully scanning her body with an advanced medical device, checking her vital signs. Her heartbeat was weak but steady. Her breathing, while labored, was regular. The Queen was holding on, but for how long? Blake didn't know, and that uncertainty made his work even more urgent. The medical team had already tried traditional methods: nerve stimulation, cellular regeneration, and even advanced painkillers. But none of these had worked. Blake's mind raced as he examined the data. He needed something different, something unique. He remembered a rare technique that humans had developed, a method that used a combination of neurostimulation and bioelectric currents to repair nerve damage. It had only been tested on humans, but Blake had a theory. If he could adapt it to the Exarech physiology, it might just work. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot he had. He looked at Zarantha again, her face still and expressionless. There was something about her that made Blake pause. Despite her race's cold reputation, there was a quiet strength in her features. She was a queen, a leader, someone who had commanded armies and shaped the destiny of an entire species. And now, she was at the mercy of a human medic. Blake couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. If he failed, it wouldn't just be her life lost. It would be a blow to the Exarech people, a loss that could fracture their already unstable empire. Blake set to work, carefully adjusting the devices to send the bioelectric signals into Zarentha's nervous system. His hands were steady, his mind clear. He knew the procedure was risky. One wrong move, and the damage could be irreversible. But Blake wasn't thinking about the risks. He was thinking about the possibility of success. Time passed slowly as Blake worked tirelessly. The lights above flickered slightly, and the soft whir of the machines was the only sound in the room. The Exarch officer stood silently by, watching, waiting for Blake to fail. But Blake didn't let the pressure get to him. He had one goal: to save this queen, to give her a chance to rise again. After hours of delicate work, Blake took a step back and surveyed the results. Zarentha's vital signs had stabilized, and there was a faint improvement in her nerve activity. It was not a cure, but it was progress, something no one had expected. Blake allowed himself a small breath of relief, but it was only the beginning. The real challenge was just starting. Blake stood quietly in the dim light of the medical bay, watching the flickering monitors that displayed Zarentha's vitals. His eyes were tired, but there was a sense of accomplishment in them. It had been hours since he started his treatment, and though he had made some progress, there was still so much more to do. Zarentha's condition had stabilized slightly, but she wasn't out of danger. In fact, the hardest part was just beginning. He wiped his brow, taking a deep breath, and looked down at the queen once more. She had been unconscious the entire time, but the steady rise and fall of her chest was a sign that his efforts were having some effect. There was hope. The bioelectric treatment had done something that none of the Exarch medics had been able to achieve. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Blake knew that the process was delicate. The human body and the Exarch body were worlds apart. What worked for one might fail for the other. But the fact that Zarentha's vitals had improved meant that his theory might actually hold water. He had a chance. They had a chance. As he continued to monitor the equipment, a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was the officer who had been watching him earlier, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but Blake could see the hint of curiosity in his eyes. "What have you done, human?" the officer asked, his voice low but tense. Blake didn't look up. "I started treatment," he replied simply. "It's not a cure, but it's something. Her condition is improving." The officer was silent for a moment, then stepped into the room. His sharp eyes scanned the monitors, then returned to Blake. "I don't understand. How could you possibly know what to do? You are not trained in Exarch medicine." Blake finally turned to face him. "I'm not trained in Exarch medicine, but I've worked with many different species. Every race has its own weaknesses and strengths. I've learned to adapt, to think outside the box. And right now, that's what I'm doing. I'm giving her a chance." The officer's eyes narrowed. "A chance. The queen is a symbol of our power. If she dies, that Exarch will fall into chaos. Your chance could be the end of us all." Blake held the officer's gaze, unflinching. "I understand that. But I'm not trying to harm her. I'm trying to save her. No one else will. If I fail, it won't be because I didn't try." The officer's gaze softened just slightly, but he still looked skeptical. "You think you can save her? After all this time, after everything that has happened, you think a human medic can do what our greatest minds could not?" "I'm not claiming to be a miracle worker," Blake replied, his voice steady. "But I have knowledge, skills, and determination. More than that, I have something you might not understand: empathy. I see a life in front of me, and I'm not just going to walk away from it." The officer didn't respond right away, but the weight of Blake's words seemed to linger in the air. After a long pause, he spoke again, this time more quietly. "You know that even if you save her, the Council will not be grateful. The Exarch do not value weakness, and they certainly do not value humans. If you succeed, it will not be for your benefit." Blake didn't flinch at the officer's warning. "That's not why I'm doing this. I'm doing it because it's right, because no one else is willing to try. He turned back to the Queen, his fingers gently adjusting the devices connected to her. I don't care what the council thinks. I care about her life. That's all. The officer studied Blake for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke again. You're a fool, human. But maybe you're not completely useless. He turned to leave, but before he did, he added, I will tell the others of your progress. But know this, if the Queen survives, there will be those who will want to test your loyalty. Do not think they will forget this. Blake nodded, though he had already anticipated that the Sirac would not simply let him walk away unscathed, no matter the outcome. He wasn't doing this for reward or recognition, but that didn't mean the consequences wouldn't be high. As the officer left the room, Blake turned his focus back to Zarantha. He couldn't afford to get distracted by the politics of the Sirac. He had a job to do, and he was going to do it to the best of his ability. The Queen's life was still hanging by a thread, and Blake wasn't about to let go of that thread without a fight. He set to work again, his hands moving with precision and care. Every adjustment he made brought him closer to something incredible. If Zarantha survived this, it wouldn't just be a victory for her. It would be a victory for life itself. Proof that compassion and determination could triumph even in the darkest of times. For now, all Blake could do was keep pushing forward, step by step, toward the light at the end of the tunnel. He had no idea what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't stop until Zarantha had a chance to rise again. Days passed, and Zarantha's condition slowly improved. Blake could feel a glimmer of hope rising within him, though he knew the road ahead was still long and uncertain. Her vitals were stabilizing, and there was even a slight improvement in her muscle response. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep Blake going. Every small victory was another step closer to the impossible. But as Zarantha's health began to improve, the pressure on Blake increased. The Exarch Council, who had originally dismissed his efforts, were now paying close attention. Their eyes were on him, watching every move he made. The officer who had spoken with him earlier came by regularly to check on Zarantha's progress, his sharp eyes always assessing. Blake could feel the tension in the air, and he knew it wasn't just because of the Queen's life hanging in the balance. It was about control. The Sirac were not a people who tolerated weakness or failure, and Blake's success had caused a stir among their leadership. They weren't used to being questioned or challenged, least of all by a human. They had grown accustomed to commanding, not begging for help. Blake knew that his success in treating Zarantha had already upset the balance of power within the Exarch Council. Some were beginning to see him as a threat, a human who had achieved something they couldn't. One afternoon, as Blake worked in the medical bay, the door opened. This time, it wasn't just the officer who had been watching him. Several high-ranking members of the Exarch Council stepped into the room, their tall figures casting long shadows across the floor. Their faces were unreadable, but Blake could see the unease in their eyes. "You've made progress, human," one of the council members said coldly, his voice laced with skepticism. "But you've also crossed a line." Blake stood up, wiping his hands on his uniform. He wasn't intimidated by their presence, but he knew this conversation would be important. "I've done my best to help the Queen," he said evenly. "She's still not out of danger, but her condition is better than it was." One of the council members stepped forward, his armor gleaming in the light. "We didn't ask for your help," he said sharply. "You are a medic, nothing more. The Queen is our leader, and we alone decide what happens to her." Blake didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for anything in return," he replied. "I'm doing what I'm trained to do, what anyone would do if they saw someone suffering." The council member's eyes narrowed, and the air grew tense. "You misunderstand. It's not about your training. It's about power. By saving the Queen, you've put yourself in a dangerous position. We do not appreciate being indebted to anyone, especially a human." Blake felt the weight of the council's words. They were more than just angry. They were threatened. His success had shifted the balance of power, and that Sirac were not a species known for accepting challenges to their authority. But Blake had never been interested in their politics. He only cared about Zarentha's life, not the games they played. "I didn't do this for your approval," Blake said, his voice firm. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. The Queen's life is worth saving. That's all that matters to me." The council members exchanged looks, their silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, the lead council member spoke again, this time with a hint of something resembling respect. "You are a fool, human, but there is something to be said for your persistence. Still, understand this. If Zarentha survives, you will be forced to face the consequences of your actions. The Xerac do not forget such things." Blake stood his ground, though the council's words had an impact. He had expected resistance, but he had never anticipated the level of hostility he was now facing. The Xerac had never been a forgiving species, and he knew that his efforts would not be met with gratitude. Instead, they would be met with suspicion, and worse, distrust. The council would not let him walk away unscathed. But Blake wasn't concerned about that. What mattered was Zarentha's survival, not the politics that surrounded her. "I don't need your approval," Blake said quietly, but with conviction. "I only need her to live." The council members looked at him, their expressions unreadable. The room was thick with tension, but Blake remained calm. He had made his choice. No matter the cost, he would do whatever it took to save the Queen. As the council members turned to leave, the officer who had been watching Blake all along paused for a moment. His gaze lingered on the human medic, and for the first time, Blake saw something in the officer's eyes, something that wasn't pure disdain. It was something like doubt. "You've made a difference, human," the officer said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "But remember, there is always a price for saving a life, especially one as important as the Queen's." Blake nodded, but he didn't respond. He knew what the officer meant. The price would be steep, but he was ready to pay it. For Zarentha, for the chance to give her life back. As the door closed behind them, Blake turned back to the Queen. Her condition was still fragile, but he had made a promise. He wasn't going to stop now. The road ahead was full of uncertainty, but Blake was determined to see it through. For her, the days dragged on as Blake worked tirelessly to stabilize Zarentha. Her condition improved slowly, but there were still many hurdles to overcome. He had no illusions that the road ahead would be easy. Every small victory brought him closer to his goal, but each step forward also meant facing new challenges. The Xerac Council's pressure on him was growing, and with it, his sense of isolation. The weight of his decision, the burden of saving Zarentha, was starting to take its toll. Blake's hands were sore from working around the clock, but he pushed through. The medical bay had become his world, the constant beeping of the monitors and the hum of the machines his only companions. He had little time for sleep, eating only when he could spare a few minutes. His mind was consumed by one thought: Zarentha. The Queen's survival was the only thing that mattered. If he failed now, everything would be for nothing. One afternoon, as Blake was adjusting the equipment attached to Zarentha's body, he was interrupted by the soft sound of the door opening. He turned to see the officer who had been watching him standing in the doorway. His expression was stern, but there was a different look in his eyes now. It was not hostility, but something more, curious. Blake didn't have time to waste on questions, so he returned his focus to the Queen, continuing his work. "Is she going to make it?" the officer asked quietly, his voice unusually calm. Blake paused for a moment, considering the question. "I'm not sure," he said truthfully, "but she's showing signs of recovery. It's not over yet, but she's holding on." The officer stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Zarentha. "The council wants her back," he said, his tone less sharp than usual. "They don't care about your methods. They want results. And soon." Blake turned to face the officer, his expression steady. "I can't rush this. Her recovery isn't something I can control. All I can do is give her a chance." The officer didn't respond immediately, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was starting to see things from Blake's perspective. He looked at the Queen for a long moment, then back at Blake. "You're risking everything for her," he said, his voice soft. "Do you know what will happen if you fail?" Blake met the officer's gaze. "I know the risks," he said, "but I'm not going to stop. Not when I'm this close." The officer studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "I see. You're not like the others. You actually care." Blake shrugged, not knowing how to respond. "I'm a medic. I care about life. That's what I'm here for." The officer seemed to think for a moment before speaking again. "I don't agree with your methods, human, but I respect your persistence. And maybe that's what the Queen needs. Someone who will keep fighting for her, no matter the cost." Blake didn't know how to react to that. The officer's words were unexpected, and they made him pause. For the first time since he'd started treating Zarantha, he began to wonder if his actions were truly making a difference. Was the officer right? Was it his persistence, his refusal to give up, that was the key? Perhaps it wasn't just the medical techniques that mattered. It was the heart behind them. "I don't care about your respect," Blake said, shaking his head. "I care about her life. If you want results, let me do my work." The officer's lips tightened into a thin line, but there was no anger in his eyes. Instead, there was something that almost resembled understanding. "I won't stop you, human," he said quietly. "But know this, you're not just saving the Queen. You're risking everything for the Turak. If she survives, the balance will shift. There will be consequences." Blake nodded, his resolve firm. "I'm prepared for whatever comes next." As the officer turned to leave, Blake felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't that the officer had given him permission to continue. It was the recognition that perhaps he wasn't alone in this fight. The officer, while still loyal to his people, had shown a flicker of empathy. It was a small thing, but it meant something. Blake turned back to Zarantha, the Queen's life still in his hands. The monitors beeped steadily, and he adjusted the equipment once more. He was so close. The Queen's body had begun to respond more positively, the once dead nerves starting to show slight flickers of activity. There was still a long way to go, but Blake could see the faintest light at the end of the tunnel. The road ahead would be difficult, but Blake had come this far, and he wasn't about to give up now. The stakes were higher than ever, and the consequences of failure loomed large. But Blake had made a promise. To the Queen, to her people, and to himself, that he would do everything in his power to save her. He adjusted the settings on the medical equipment, his hands moving with purpose. Each moment was critical now, and Blake was determined to see this through. For Zarantha. For life. No matter the cost. Blake stood over Zarantha, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the medical equipment. The air in the room felt thick with anticipation. Every second felt like an eternity, but he couldn't afford to slow down. The Queen's survival was hanging by a thread, and his work was the only thing that could save her. Despite the progress, her condition was still unstable, and Blake knew that time was running out. The Exarch Council's pressure had reached its peak. They wanted results, and they wanted them now. As he made another adjustment to the machines, Blake took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind. He had never faced a challenge like this before. He had worked with many different species, but never had the stakes been so high. The Queen of the Exarch wasn't just another patient. She was their leader, their symbol of power. If he failed, the consequences would be unimaginable, not just for him, but for the entire galaxy. Blake thought about everything he had been through to get to this point. The long hours, the isolation, the constant pressure from the Council. He had sacrificed so much, but he knew it was worth it. He wasn't just saving Zarantha, he was proving that humanity could make a difference in the galaxy, that compassion and determination could overcome even the greatest of odds. He glanced at the Queen, her form still pale and fragile, but there was something different about her now. Her vitals had improved more than ever before, and the faintest flicker of life seemed to pulse within her. Blake's heart raced as he saw the first signs of movement. It was small, just a twitch of a finger, but it was enough to give him hope. He had been working nonstop for days, barely eating or sleeping. His body ached, but his mind was focused. Nothing mattered but Zarentha's recovery. He could feel the weight of the council's eyes on him, but he couldn't let it distract him. This was bigger than politics, bigger than power struggles. This was about saving a life, and Blake was determined to do just that. The door opened softly behind him, and Blake turned to see the officer who had spoken with him earlier. This time, the officer didn't speak right away. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. Blake knew that the officer had been watching him closely, perhaps even waiting for him to fail. But Blake wasn't ready to give up. "How's she doing?" the officer asked, his voice quieter than usual. Blake didn't take his eyes off Zarentha as he answered. "She's improving. It's slow, but I can see signs that she's responding. I need more time, though. Just a little more." The officer crossed his arms, his gaze flickering between Blake and the Queen. "You've done more than any of us expected. But you've also put yourself in a difficult position. If she survives, things will change. The council will expect you to answer for what you've done." Blake nodded, his face hardening. "I know, but I didn't do this for the council. I did it for her." The officer was silent for a moment, studying Blake with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke again, his voice a little softer this time. "You're risking everything, human. The Xerac don't forget easily, and they don't forgive. If the Queen lives, they may ask you to pay a price you're not prepared for." Blake turned to face the officer, his eyes steady. "I understand the risks, but I won't stop. Not now." The officer seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding slowly. "You are more determined than I thought. I don't agree with your methods, but there is something admirable about your persistence." Blake didn't respond. He wasn't looking for approval. He wasn't looking for respect. He was focused on one thing: Zarentha. As the officer left the room, Blake turned back to the Queen, his hands moving with renewed purpose. He could feel the faintest pulse of hope growing within him. Zarentha's vitals were becoming more stable with every passing minute, and he could see her body starting to respond. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He wasn't just saving her, he was giving her a chance at life. For the first time in days, Blake allowed himself a brief moment of relief. He had made it this far, and he wasn't going to stop. His heart pounded in his chest as he focused on the task at hand. The future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: he had done everything he could to save her. As the hours passed, Blake continued to work tirelessly. His body was exhausted, but his mind was sharp. Zarentha's body was slowly but surely coming back to life, and Blake could feel the energy in the room shift. There was a sense of anticipation, as if the Queen was on the verge of awakening. Blake couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had defied the odds, and now he was about to see the results. With one final adjustment to the medical equipment, Blake stepped back, his breath held in anticipation. The room was silent for a moment, and then, slowly, Zarentha's eyes fluttered open. Blake's heart skipped a beat as she looked up at him, her gaze filled with confusion and pain, but also something else, something like gratitude. Blake smiled, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over him. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, his voice full of quiet joy. It was a promise, and in that moment, it felt like the weight of the galaxy had lifted from his shoulders. Zarentha's journey was far from over, but for the first time in days, Blake allowed himself to believe that she would make it. Against all odds, she was alive, and he had given her a chance to fight for her future. Blake stood at the foot of Zarentha's bed, watching as the Queen slowly regained her strength. The room was still, but the air felt charged with the quiet power of her recovery. Her breathing had steadied, and there was a clear sense of life returning to her once fragile form. Her once pale skin had gained a healthy color, and her eyes, though still weary, now held a spark of awareness. For the first time since her injury, there was no question about her survival. Blake's heart swelled with quiet pride. He had done it. Against all odds, he had saved the Queen of the Turak. The very thought of it seemed impossible, yet here they were, on the brink of a new chapter. Zarantha shifted slightly in the bed, her eyes flickering open. Blake stepped closer, his face full of concern but also hope. "How do you feel?" he asked softly, not wanting to startle her. Her voice, though weak, was clear as she looked up at him. "Stronger," she replied with a faint smile, though it was clear she still had a long way to go. "I never thought I'd see this day." Blake's smile mirrored hers. "I'm glad you're awake," he said, relieved. "You've come a long way." Zarantha's gaze softened as she took in her surroundings. She was still in the medical bay, but there was a different energy about her now. The once helpless queen had begun to reclaim her strength, and it was clear that her mind was already working, processing the events that had led to her recovery. "I owe you my life," she said, her voice steady but tinged with gratitude. "And for that, I will be forever grateful. But I know you didn't do this for me alone." Blake nodded. He had never expected praise or recognition for what he had done. "I did it because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "No one should have to suffer, no matter their title or rank." Zarantha's expression grew serious. She struggled to sit up, and Blake gently helped her, making sure she was comfortable. "Your actions have not gone unnoticed," she said. "The council, they will see you as a threat, but I am not like them. You did not save me for their approval." Blake listened intently, already aware of the tension between him and that Exarch council. He had felt their disapproval, their suspicion. They did not trust him, and they never would. But Zarantha's words gave him something different, an understanding of the situation from her perspective. She was the queen, and her words carried weight. "If they want to punish me for saving you," Blake said with quiet resolve, "then they'll have to do it. I'm not afraid. You were worth it." Zarantha's eyes flickered with a mix of admiration and sadness. "You have a brave heart, human," she said softly. "But the Turak are not kind to those who challenge their authority. If you choose to stay in this galaxy, your life will not be the same. There will be consequences. The council, they will want to make an example of you." Blake had already considered that possibility. He had no illusions about what would happen next. The Turak were a powerful and unforgiving species, and he had placed himself at the center of their storm. But he was prepared for whatever came next. He had saved Zarantha's life, and that to him was enough. "I'll face whatever comes," Blake said, his voice unwavering. "But I did what I had to do." Zarantha's gaze softened, and for a moment she said nothing. Then she placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm despite her weakened state. "You are more than a medic, Blake," she said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "You have proven that humans are capable of much more than we thought. The council may not understand, but you have changed my view of your kind." Blake was taken aback by her words, though he tried not to show it. He hadn't done this for recognition, but her acknowledgement meant more than he could have imagined. "I didn't do this to change in anyone's mind," he replied honestly. "I did it because I believe that all lives are worth saving." Zarantha nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Then I will ensure you are not forgotten. When I am well enough, I will speak on your behalf. I will make sure the council understands that you are not their enemy, and that you were a friend to me when no one else would be." Blake felt a wave of relief wash over him at her words. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was more than he had hoped for. For the first time, he felt like his actions had not only saved a life, but had earned him a place in a larger story. A story he would never have imagined when he first arrived on this foreign world. As Zarantha's strength continued to return, the threat of the council still loomed, but Blake felt a new sense of resolve. Whatever happened, he had done the right thing. He had saved a life, and that would always be worth fighting for. The Queen's recovery was far from over, and the challenges ahead were great. But for now, in this moment, Blake allowed himself a quiet moment of peace. He had made a difference, and that was all that mattered. The rest could wait. Blake stood beside Zarentha, ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would navigate the uncertain future, united in the knowledge that sometimes one life could change the course of everything.